Welcome to the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. The Defense Horizon Journal is a professional and academic journal that features essays, reports, and analyses covering geopolitics and law, security and defense policy, peace and conflict studies, applied military science, as well as developments in weapons technology. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org.
Episode number 60. India's Climate InAction is Crucial for Global InStability. By Leena Shrivastava and Anandajit Goswami. India's economic importance in the world today. India is a paradoxical country that holds enormous promise while simultaneously posing significant challenges to the global climate and its own sustainable development goals. India added 13 people to the list of the world's billionaires, taking the total number to 284. The collective wealth of India's rich has increased by 10% since 2024, resulting in a combined wealth that exceeds the entire economy of Saudi Arabia. It ranks third globally in the number of billionaires, behind the United States and the People's Republic of China, PRC, and has become the world's fourth largest economy. Thus, despite the concerning concentration of income and wealth in the top echelons of India's population, the burgeoning middle class makes India a vital market for the world. India surpassed PRC's population towards the end of April 2023 to become the world's most populous nation. Moreover, while the overall unemployment rate in the country, as per official estimates, has declined to 5.1%, the unemployment rate in the age group of 15 to 29 years of age worryingly stood at 13.8%, urban 17.2%. Also worrying is the worker-population ratio, share of employed persons in the population, which stood at about 52.8% at the national average level and a mere 32.5% for women, 23.5% in urban areas. On the positive side, the median age of India's population at 28.44 years is 11 years younger than in PRC, offering a thriving market and workforce for the future. In addition, the Indian government has been focusing on both the employability of its workforce and the faster integration of women in its workforce. As noted in a recent report from the UK-India Business Council in relation to its internal environment, India's young population has become increasingly employable and impressively qualified. From engineering excellence to digital dynamism, India's workers are at the forefront of global innovation and brilliance. From an external perspective, over the world, countries face hiring challenges. India, with its huge, young, and tech-savvy population, plays a key role in redressing the imbalance of high demand and constrained supply. India's young workforce is both technically highly skilled and proficient in the English language, a combination that places them at the forefront of services rather than manufacturing and as a key driver for Industry 4.0. Having noted the above, the promise of India as an emerging developed economy seems precariously predicated on an increasingly volatile and uncertain world, from unexpected and rapidly emerging changes in the world order, to the threat of runaway climate change, and a strong anti-immigration, nationalist sentiment in the developed world. Simply put, these developments not only threaten to choke some of the historical avenues for addressing India's economic and social rebalancing needs but, on top of a highly stressed natural resource base, greatly enhance the country's climate-imposed vulnerabilities. Climate change and externality of unbridled consumption. Formal recognition of the potential threat posed by climate change to the world was established with the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in 1988. In these last 37 years, with increasing confidence leading to near certainty today, scientists were able to identify the causal actors and/or factors for climatic changes, 2. The impacts of climate change and their cascading effects, 3. The interconnections between Earth systems, as also 4. The vulnerabilities of not just the human species but all biodiversity on planet Earth. A detailed analysis of a global database of scenarios generated from sophisticated coupled models across the world led to the recommendation that limiting warming to around 1.5 degrees Celsius (2.7 degrees Fahrenheit) requires global greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced by 43% by 2030. These reductions are to be achieved over the emissions levels of 2019. Until the 29th Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC, COP, held in Baku in November 2024, carbon emissions from fossil fuels continue to grow, albeit at a slowing rate. Emissions from land use change, although still high, reduced by about 20% in the decade ending 2024. Clearly, emissions have not yet peaked. And 2024 is confirmed by the European Union Copernicus Climate Change Service to be the warmest year on record globally, and the first calendar year that the average global temperature exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius above its pre-industrial level. Thus, 30 years after the first COP and 10 years after the Paris Agreement, despite increasingly bitter negotiations, the world is still far from reaching the goal, Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, of global peaking of emissions as soon as possible and is not on track to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Following the Paris Agreement in 2015, a large number of state and non-state actors made pledges to achieve net zero emissions by specific years according to their national conditions, drawing upon the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR, recognized by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, in 1992. PRC pledged to achieve net zero by 2060 and India by 2070. The European Union aims to become the first net zero continent by 2050. The USA has recently walked out of all its climate commitments. As per the Emissions Gap Report, EGR, of 2024, under all scenarios of policies and the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, made by governments, the world has a 100% likelihood of breaking the 1.5 degrees Celsius guardrail. However, the inclusion of all net zero pledges by non-state actors also offers a glimmer of hope, reducing this likelihood to 77%, range 64 to 97%. If all conditional NDCs are met, the world still has a 79%, 19 to 100% range, likelihood of exceeding 2 degrees Celsius. However, if pledges from non-state actors are accounted for, the likelihood of exceeding the 2 degrees Celsius guardrail falls to 20%. India, with its burgeoning population and huge development requirements driving the need for economic growth, is still a growing contributor to global GHG emissions. However, a year-to-year cross-country comparison of performance may be unsuitable in this case, as India has committed to achieving net zero by 2070. India's climate commitments and actions should be viewed against the fact that its per capita emissions in 2023 are at 2.9 tons of CO2 equivalent, TCO2e, as against 18 TCO2e for the USA and 11 TCO2e for the PRC, while its share in cumulative historical emissions from 1850 to 2022 is a mere 3% of the total. By contrast, the share of the US in the stock of historical GHG emissions is 20%, while that of the PRC and the EU is 12% each. The Global Carbon Budget 2024 reports that India has reduced its decadal growth in fossil CO2 emissions from 6.4% between 2004 and 2013 to 3.6% between 2014 and 2023. Having said that, India can play a significant role in climate mitigation, as it is currently the third largest emitter of GHGs, with a share of 8%, EGR 2024. With a per capita total energy consumption of 27.3 GJ capita, as against 120 in PRC and 277 in the US, and a per capita electricity consumption of 1,463 kilowatt-hours, as against 8540 in PRC and 4128 in the US, skewed also by the extreme income inequality, it can be reasonably expected that India's energy consumption will increase rapidly and significantly. While it is not easy to assess an individual country's contributions and alignment to a 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius aligned pathway, some efforts have been made in this direction. The Climate Action Tracker estimates that, based on current policies, India would be 135 to 150% above 2005 levels in 2035, whereas a 1.5 degree C-aligned trajectory would only allow an 18% increase over 2005 by 2035. It goes on to say that, achieving this level of action will not be possible without India receiving substantial finance and other support. Climate Analytics calls for a phase-out of coal use in India in the period 2035 to 2040 to align with a 1.5 degrees Celsius target. According to a recent study, India is likely to meet the goals it set for itself by 2030. In its last biennial update report, India confirmed that its emissions intensity reduction target is on track. Its non-fossil fuel-based power generation capacity, including nuclear, is at 46.52% as of 2024, as against a target of 50% by 2030, and it has created an additional carbon sink of 2.29 billion tons, as against a target of 2.5 to 3 billion tons. However, India has delayed its commitments for 2035, likely due to the perceived unfairness of the climate finance commitments of the developed world at COP29 in Baku, and to give itself more time to review renewed commitments from other countries. Instead, India is actively engaged in preparations for its first national adaptation plan to submit for COP30. While meeting its 2030 commitments, it is interesting to note that India set up 220 gigawatts of renewable energy (RE) capacity by March 2025, but also enhanced coal output to over 1 billion tons, with nearly 88% going to the power sector. India also has plans to massively increase its coal-based thermal power capacity. All this is reflective of India's unmet and growing electricity demand, the lower share of renewable energy in generation, as against capacity, the significant investments that would be required in grid infrastructure and other systems to efficiently manage a larger share of RE, concerns around energy security and large losses of employment. To appreciate the opportunities provided by India's electricity sector, which currently accounts for 1 GTCO2, equaling 40% of India's emissions, and is projected to go up to 2.4 under base case scenario, a study by Bisht and Sharma estimates that achieving peaking power emissions by 2030 and deploying CCS facilitates net zero goal by 2050, but pushing back net zero target to 2070 could double cumulative emissions by mid-century. In a similar vein, India's industrial capacity growth ambition is in the 6 to 8% range, signifying large energy demands arising in the hard-to-abate sectors. A low car penetration rate of only 44 cars per 1,000 people signals a huge future market for vehicles, with sales growing at a CAGR, compound annual growth rate, of 3.5% to reach 5.1 million vehicles by 2030. Of this, Moody's expects the share of electric vehicles to be 12 to 15%, roughly half of India's ambition, largely due to the nascent state of infrastructure and high cost of batteries. This provides a huge opportunity to accelerate the reductions in emissions in India, given well-designed incentives and access to capital. Accelerating structural adjustments in India's development pathway could possibly help India avoid a further lock-in to fossil-intensive pathways and achieve their net zero goals before 2070. Climate impacts, vulnerability and resilience. While India is grappling with the growth pathways and mitigation choices available to it, the already visible climate impacts on the country are disproportionately large and potentially debilitating. 2024 was the first full year when temperatures remained more than 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than the global average pre-industrial temperatures. The Indian Meteorological Department reported that the annual mean land surface air temperature averaged over India during 2024 was plus 0.65 degrees Celsius above the long-term average 1991 to 2020 period. This marked the warmest year since nationwide records began in 1901. The 2024 monsoon season rainfall over the country as a whole was 108% of its long-period average, LPA. Our cyclonic storms formed over the North Indian Ocean. In addition to these cyclones, extreme weather events such as extremely heavy rainfall, floods, landslides, lightning, thunderstorms, droughts, and others were also experienced in various parts of the country. According to the Center for Science and Environment, CSE, extreme weather affected more than 4 million hectares of agricultural land in 2024, more than double that in 2022. This is particularly worrying as the agriculture sector's share in employment is rising, possibly due to the inadequacy of employment opportunities in urban areas, as highlighted at the beginning of this paper. Also worrying is the finding that the average size of land holding declined from 1.08 hectares in 2016 to 17 to 0.74 hectares in 2021 to 22, compounding the impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable. Lancet estimates that in 2023, 181 billion potential labor hours were lost in India due to heat exposure, an increase of 50% over the 1990 to 1999 average. This translates into a loss of $141 billion, with the agriculture sector suffering roughly half of these losses. It also estimates that the transmission potential for dengue fever transmitted by Aedes albopictus mosquitoes increased by 85% from 1951 to 1960 to 2014 to 2023. Also, from 2014 to 2023, the length of coastline with conditions suitable for the transmission of Vibrio pathogens at any one time during the year was 23% greater than in 1990 to 1999, potentially exposing 210 million people. With increasing scientific consensus that Greenland and West Antarctica could reach tipping points at 1.5 degrees Celsius, the consequences for a sea level rise at the higher end, or more, of the increasingly likely projected 40 to 80 centimeters in IPCC 6 are dire. India has a coastline of 7,500 kilometers with more than 250 million people living within 50 kilometers of the coastline and several megacities. India is also a major beneficiary of a significant expanse of the Hindu Kush Himalayas, which acts as a reservoir of fresh water feeding billions in the region. It also has nearly half its population dependent on the waters of the Himalayas for drinking water, irrigation, and other uses. Apart from the vulnerabilities of this huge population, with the rapidly melting glacier of the Himalayas, there is a significant rise in the threat of glacial lake outburst flood, GLOF, events and other extreme weather disasters. With nearly 21% of its land under forest cover, India is home to 4 biodiversity hotspots and has a rich biodiversity outside the hotspots, too. The changing climate is already resulting in increased instances and intensity of forest fires, which are projected to increase over time. Days with severe fire weather danger will increase by up to 60% in dry forests, but will reduce by up to 40% in humid forests. The fire season will be longer by 3 to 61 days across the country, and the pre-monsoon fire season will become more intense over 55% of forests. With this level of vulnerabilities and extent of exposed populations, India likely should have enhanced its focus on adaptation earlier than it has. However, the scale and spread of impact that India now faces are so vast that a serious adaptation effort today, even with the currently absent international support, would likely leave huge populations critically vulnerable. Global mitigation ambition will have to increase exponentially to limit global average temperature increases to as close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible, combined with the now unavoidable measures to capture and remove carbon dioxide from Earth's atmosphere to bring temperature increases below 1.5 degrees Celsius if possible. Equity, justice, and security. India is clearly a victim of climate change, and the EGR 2024 acknowledges its minor role in building the stock of GHGs in Earth's atmosphere. Despite the principle of CBDR being an integral part of the UNFCCC, India is often under pressure to play more than a fair role in costly climate transitions. Undoubtedly, India's conglomerates, the top 10% of its population holding close to 75% of national wealth, and the development in its metro cities mask the real poverty that exists in the country. However, the world needs to see the challenge of raising the living standards of the majority of India, if not for equity reasons, then for selfish reasons. The world needs India to thrive for the stable democracy it is, for the human resources it provides, for the market it creates, and for its innovation potential. And it needs all this without interruption and with accelerated GHG emissions reductions. The world must invest in India to reap benefits for itself, both in the short term and in the long term. As India looks to mitigate, adapt, and build resilience, with or without international support, it is imperative that social equity considerations are core to the very design of all policies and interventions. To the extent that international support is flowing either as investments or as a responsibility, the selfish motive must also internalize the criticality of strengthening social equity. An article in the Wharton magazine in 2017 stressed that the greatest threats to India's long-term stability are rooted in social risks. When grievances and needs are left unaddressed, social risk increases and seemingly insignificant events can trigger protests, strikes, litigation, looting, work stoppages, and other violence. BMI, a global country risk research firm, has cautioned against the implications of youth unemployment, a key risk factor in India's transition away from coal. A recent study by ACPET also noted that, beyond the loss of jobs associated with coal mining activities concentrated in the eastern regions of India, the closure of coal mines adversely affects the wider region and populations, shutting down livelihoods and life choices within a 5-kilometer radius of coal mines in the instance. The study highlighted the loss of traditional knowledge and skills and the loss of land holdings, which, combined with low coverage by social security schemes like ration cards, threatens to leave the region as a whole worse off and extremely vulnerable. It underscores the need for a more careful and calibrated, bottom-up approach to just energy transitions. Similarly, many papers have addressed the key components of a just transition when phasing out ICE engines and replacing them with electric vehicles in particular. However, a closer examination shows that efforts to provide skilling or reskilling and vocational training to support the electric vehicle ecosystem may not address the same workforce that would be displaced by the phase-out of ICE engines. The value chains needed to support electric vehicles are also likely not as robust, leading to significant net job losses, too. Just transition initiatives would also have to be able to address such challenges. Around the same time, the rating agency Moody's highlighted the potential instability India faces due to rising water shortages, as it enhances volatility and reduces resilience. When India banned rice exports in 2023 to stabilize domestic prices and ensure domestic demand was met, it increased the risk of political instability in Asia and Africa, highlighting the potential global fallout of climate change impacts on water supplies in India. In short, India is a country on the brink of an environmental collapse with many social risk factors threatening its own prosperity as well as that of others. It is thus of utmost importance that when designing and implementing any mitigation and/or adaptation projects, the adoption of a just approach is both visible and recognized. Authors: Lina Shrivastava is a renowned expert in sustainable development. She retired as Deputy Director General for Science at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, and, prior to that, was an Executive Director at TERI, India. Her research areas focus on climate and energy policies and strategies. Anandajit Goswami is Professor and Director at the School of Behavioral and Social Sciences, RIAS, Visiting Fellow at Ashoka University, and Visiting Honorary Professor at IMPRI. His research focuses on sustainability, climate transitions, energy economics, and just transitions. The views contained in this article are the authors alone and do not represent the views of their affiliated institutions.
This was the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org. Thank you for listening.